as they work every day to pursue the news. Well, hello and welcome to Media and Society. I am your host, Naledi Muleo, and this is, of course, the show where we look at the intersection between the media and society. And, of course, the show really isn't complete without your say or your input. So give us a call over the next hour. The number is 011-714-0661 or 0662. Or get onto Twitter and tweet us using hashtag SABC Media Society or tweet at SABC_MNS. Let's get into the discussion for today. We're going to be talking about the mental health of media practitioners. But before we do that, let's quickly do this. More South Africans that have been evacuated from Sudan are expected to arrive back home this morning. The International Relations Minister, Minister Naledi Pandor, is expected to be at the Waterkloof military base in Pretoria to welcome them. The first batch of 10 South Africans rescued from Sudan arrived at the OR Tambo International Airport last night. Fighting is continuing in Sudan, despite the army and paramilitary rapid support forces agreeing to extend the ceasefire by 72 hours. Kaelihle Kumalo is currently at OR Tambo International, standing by for the evacuees. Kaelihle, a good morning to you. I think, firstly, explain to us what we know about those that have already made their way back into the country.
Well, certainly, Naledi, we just got now the information that there's a second batch that's just arrived in South Africa around 7 o'clock this morning. So they're yet to be cleared from the customs as they'll be going through the immigration control. But most importantly, Naledi, it's been quite a very harrowing experience for these South Africans, really traversing war-torn parts of that northeast African country, Sudan, as it continues to face the strife. And it is quite incredible, really, to speak to the very first batch that got here at home last night. They were really just telling us the very gory experiences that they had to endure, where they were really just going through a very terrible time, as Sudan is going through a very terrible political standoff. A lot of them, they talk about hearing all kinds of guns and really just skirmishes are really erupted in Sudan. But we're expecting them to be welcomed by the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Naledi Pandor. So the department really has been at the forefront in terms of making sure that the evacuation succeeds. We do know that, so there were mainly two routes that were used by South Africans. Others went to Egypt in Cairo, and others went to Saudi Arabia in Jeddah via Port Sudan. So now predominantly the ones who will be arriving today, we do understand that they'll be coming via the Kenyan Airways flight. So they're expected to arrive around 11:20 in this morning. So there's a great deal of excitement from their families, who we expect to do have a word or two with them in terms of their reactions.
And I believe, Kaelihle, that what we heard as well this week from the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation is that South Africa has also been part of assisting other evacuees from Sudan, not just from South Africa, a few people from Brazil, Namibia and other countries as well.
Well, very much so, Naledi. So they really had a very broad strategy where they really accommodated other nationals as well, as opposed to South Africans. And we do understand it's about 11:20. One of, just a non-South African national who will be arriving as a British national, and another SADC country, I do understand, from Zimbabwe as well. So it's been quite a very inclusive strategy, especially because some of the embassies in Sudan came under attack from other countries, where they were primarily focusing on rescuing and evacuating the diplomatic staff. Yeah. Who really came under siege, especially because we do know that some convoys during the course of this week, we saw the French convoy as they were heading out of Khartoum, they came under siege. But of course, Naledi, when you listen to the Department really of International Relations and Cooperation, they do speak about the complexities in terms of this evacuation efforts, where they do say that it's not really easy, because really they had to engage with so many countries, the neighbors of Sudan, the Sudanese authorities themselves, to make sure that it becomes a very seamless effort as well.
Yeah.
But also something that is quite important, Naledi, at this particular point in time, we saw a statement from South Sudan President Salva Kiir indicating that he has been engaging with the two generals who are the main protagonists in this conflict, the de facto ruler of Sudan, General al-Burhan, and of course General Hemeti, who is the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, trying to make sure that they do respect the 72 hours ceasefire, but also calling for the humanitarian access corridors to be opened in Sudan to help quite a number of Sudanese really who are facing a catastrophe in light of the shortages of food, the medicine and many other things as well, especially because the healthcare facilities are really just overwhelmed by the current situation in Sudan. But of course, a very strong call as well from the African Union calling for the cessation of hostilities. We do know that they are seized with this particular issue, but something that was quite interesting as well, Naledi, from the former Prime Minister of Sudan, Hamdok, where he said this conflict, if it really becomes full-blown, it could be worse than what we saw in Syria and many other countries as well that have really had the nightmares of having conflict.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, in fact, what we're looking like in terms of getting to see an end to the hostilities in Sudan. I think you've answered that already, and the true test is really going to be whether or not we see either side there hold to that 72-hour ceasefire. But let's get back to those that are coming back home. The state that evacuees that arrived yesterday, what state they were in, Kaya, before I let you go. So just to get a sense of what exactly it is that they have been through. You've seen the horrible images coming out of Khartoum. What state were they in? What state are we expecting them, those that are arriving to come in today, to be like?
There was a sigh of relief from their side and their families as they welcomed them here, right here on Terminal A at their international arrival. So they told us about how really they had to endure very harrowing circumstances, trying to make sure that they are safe. They were very concerned, Naledi, especially because for some time now, Sudan has been experiencing internet blackout. It could be a very deliberate effort to try and conceal really what has been happening. But also in the main, a lot of them, they were talking about really the hours of moving around in the buses. And we do know that some of the convoys, but thankfully the South Africans, so far we do know that none of them were injured. But other countries, other foreign nationals who were trying to flee that war-torn country, they came under siege. But the South Africans were very grateful as well to the stakeholders who have been very instrumental in terms of their evacuation. We do know that the likes of the gift of the givers as well was very helpful in terms of facilitating, in terms of the logistics. But also, you know, I remember one of them was Jonathan, and he was telling me that they had to board this warship from the Saudi government at the port Sudan to go to Jeddah, to Saudi Arabia. They were just talking about how the Saudis were so welcoming in terms of making sure that everyone is safe and taken to the safe territory.
All right, let's leave it there. Kayalisa, thank you so much. Kayalisa Kumalo at the OR Tambo International Airport, and he's going to be bringing us live visuals as soon as the evacuees from Sudan do make their way back into South Africa. So do stay with SABC News for that one. So let's get into our discussion for media and society this morning. It's a very important one. Tomorrow we commemorate Workers' Day or May Day. So we thought let's talk about the working conditions of media practitioners and journalists in South Africa. A 2020 study by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and the University of Toronto found that a significant number of journalists that reported on the COVID-19 pandemic showed symptoms of anxiety and depression. But listen to these numbers. Around 11% reported symptoms of PTSD, and around 70% suffered from levels of psychological distress. So it's no wonder that these are the numbers that came out just out of COVID-19. Journalists and media workers are constantly exposed to traumatic events. They interface with human suffering up close every day, all while rushing to meet very tight deadlines. This, of course, can lead to burnout, anxiety, depression, and other very serious mental health issues. Additionally, journalists may face criticism, ongoing criticism, harassment, and even threats of violence, which can further exacerbate mental health problems. COVID saw a once-in-a-lifetime world event that experts say had left many video journalists, video editors, cameramen, and many other workers in this field truly traumatized. So on Workers' Day, let's talk a little bit about the working conditions of media practitioners and journalists. And to do that, I am joined in studio by Gabi Njogweni, who is SABC News video journalist. Thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you with us.
Hi, Naledi.
Must be terrifying being on the other side of the camera, no?
Yeah. kind of.
A little bit, okay. We're also joined by Vanya van der Heever, who is SABC senior reporter and producer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Good to see you back on our studio screens again. Really good to have you with us. We're also joined in studio by Dr. Shared Munyaga, who is a current president of the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology of South Africa. Thank you so much for being here to help us through these very difficult conversations that we're going to be having. We've got some guests that are joining us via Zoom as well. We've got via Zoom Mr. Leon Sadiki, who is a photojournalist and a lecturer, but a long-serving journalist himself. Leon, a good morning to you, and thank you so much for giving us your time.
Good morning.
Also joining us is Dr. Kolinda Linda, who is a clinical psychologist and also the chairperson of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. Dr. Linda, thank you so much for being here to also support the journalists in this very tough discussion.
Morning.
I want to start with the journalists, right? And I think I'm going to start with you, Leon. I think anytime that you Google Leon Sadiki, and I'd encourage the viewers to do so, the first thing that comes up is that very powerful picture that you took at Marikana back in 2012. I mean, it is a poignant picture. Talk to me a little bit about what it was like when you go back to that moment. I mean, you're celebrated for that image, but part of doing that work is that you really have to be there on the ground, experiencing some of the trauma and even some of the violence that came with that period. Take me back to 2012 for us, if you don't mind.
Yeah, good morning to the viewers. Yes, as you mentioned in your introduction, there's so many things that one has to consider when you work in a very volatile and violent situation, particularly the kind of stories that we do. And there are certain guidelines that you would use as you report. And I think with Marikana, the same guidelines that me and my colleagues have tried to use as we were reporting on the strike, as we all remember how violent the strike was. And it was the most uncomfortable space to be in. However, with experience, then you find ways of navigating and try and report the story as honest as possible. I mean, we all know that subsequent to the strike starting, more than 34 miners have been gunned down by the state, and some have been killed by their own colleagues. So it was a very uncomfortable environment to be in. And I mean, the miners were only calling for the 12,500 that they were calling from Lonmin, which Lonmin had refused to engage with them. So we were caught in the middle of the back end.
Okay. Leon, I'm gonna jump in there. I'm losing you. I'm losing you a little bit. But I want to jump in because, and you see, I'm jumping in because I think you're doing what every journalist would do with a question like that. Take me back to 2012. And today we want to talk a little bit about the conditions that journalists are working in. And I think we all remember the story of Marikana. And I'm cutting in there and I'm sort of playing devil's advocate with you because I'm saying to you, what do you remember of the feeling of being there as a journalist? You talk about just how uncomfortable it was. Perhaps there are specific scenes that you can remember, you know, being there on the day that the shootings took place, what that felt like to visually witness that and still have to keep enough calm to tell the story and take the pictures. When the bodies of security guards were found in parts of the mine and you had to be on the scene to look at those visuals, to take the pictures and to report on the story. Can you take me back to how you kept yourself going as a professional, experiencing all this trauma around you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a thing in journalism that if the story is yours, it's yours. You can't run away from it. You are expected to report on the story. And if I can take you back on the day when we arrived, there was a body next to the copy where the miners were positioned. And we had to look at that body and take pictures of it. So you can imagine you just arrived and the first thing that you see is someone who's been hacked on the face, and a skull of a cow was placed on his chest. And like any other person, that's not what you want to see. It's the most uncomfortable visual that you want to capture. However, it comes with the experience and the training, and also just engaging with fellow colleagues in the industry, that you find ways, and then you deal with the situation post the story itself, because that's the only time you will get.
Okay, we're struggling there with
any stress and trauma thereafter. So, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the line was cutting at the end there, but I'm not letting you go, Leon, because there's so much to learn from what you have to say to us. Thank you so much, Dabi. I want to come to you, and I'm going with the video journalists and the photojournalists, because visually you guys have the responsibility of getting up close and personal. Leon says that body, his job was to take the pictures of someone whose face had been hacked, and the skull of a cow was placed on their dead body. That's a gruesome image, and you have to face it and take clear, beautiful pictures. They're not beautiful, but take the picture. Talk to me about a moment that you go back to that makes you think of that, that moment for you that's really difficult to process.
When you, let's say, fees must fall, you adverts, and you start to see the students throwing stones to the security guards in the foyer, and you want to pick a side. You want to be in the safer side, but you're thinking creatively. You want to get, that image of the stone, the close-up of the stone and the visual of this and that, but you want to think safety as well. So you don't really think mental issue or mental health wellness there, and you're thinking creatively as a video journalist. So when you see now the securities taking the same stones, throwing them back to the students, and the stone throwing is coming from all directions, and you start to think, yeah, my safety, I don't have this, I don't have a helmet, anything can happen. Well, it did happen. One of the ENC, one of the other camera guys, we in a row of as broadcasters. So the guy just crosses the line wanting to get a shot of the students
from the other side.
From the other side. He didn't even get on the other side. A stone just went boom onto his face, on the side of his face. Just saw him falling down with the camera and everything. Then you start to realize, this is actually a volatile situation. Let me pick a proper side, and he's struggling to breathe because now the police are starting to bring tear gas, and you don't have experience with tear gas, and at film school or TV school they won't teach you
about tear gas.
And you have a director on your head screaming to you or talking to you, no, come down, just close your eyes, breathe, take a shot. And it's experiences like that when you, after the aftermath of that, when you get home and my friends and family will always laugh when you just get home and you start singing a struggle song and people are just chilling and, hey, Amandla, and like, yeah, this is relaxed. But it's the trauma, it's the post-trauma of the situation you just came. You didn't kind of decipher or go to a wellness center and go, and from there on to the next one, It's 21 unrest, July unrest, and you're trying to pack your equipment, and the next thing you just see a gun on your forehead, someone wanting to take all your stuff, and they did, and it happened. So it's those kind of situations where it's really important to go back and.
Are you saying that your equipment was stolen from you while you were covering the July 2021?
Just as I was packing, that the guys just let us cross. I think we were crossing to you or someone with Natasha Piri.
Yes.
And just immediately as we finished, and then when I was packing the equipment, just saw a group of guys coming to, rob me and search me of my belongings. Guy had a balaclava and a mask, and he's just pointing a gun at me. I'm like, okay, what's wrong? No, just give us everything. And then they opened the boot, and then they took the whole case of the equipment, went into the shack. So
yeah, that's trauma. That's the reality of it. Vanya, I'm going to come to you because you and I are quite similar in that a lot of the work that we do, fortunately, is in the building, right? I know that you've done some work outside of it, but I want to bring the work that what's in the building also still having quite an impact on what media practitioners do. I'll go back to one of my own stories. The death of Uina Namkhotyana had a massive impact on my mental health. Massive, massive impact. What was one of those moments for you?
Well, Naledi, I work in the field. I'm a field producer, and before this, I was a crime reporter. So I've had my fair share of gruesome stories. I think one that stands out for me, I'm a mom, was the story a couple of years ago of a 3-year-old boy who was hijacked. He was in his mom's car, and the car was hijacked, and he literally hung outside the door for 10 kilometers, and so he was mutilated. And
I remember that story.
Yeah, and I happened to see his little body. And yeah, you know, at the time, the next day you have to go to his folks' home. You have to be objective and pretend to be, or you should be professional, but when you get home,
obligation.
Yes,
Yeah.
I cannot break down and cry in front of his, I'm doing a job. But it hits you when you get home, when you're driving home, and you start getting nightmares, and you start, when the folks tell the story, you start seeing in your mind's eye what happens. And yeah, it affects you. I've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder because of my work.
Sure. That's a lot. Thanks, guys, for having for sharing all of that. And I say thank you because what a lot of people don't realize is that journalists don't have these conversations because the responsibility is to stay so stoic all the time. And I think, Dr. Linda, I'm going to come to you and start with you, and then I'll bring it back to Sharon as well. Listening to these stories, a lot of journalists will say, well, this is our daily lives. But I want to talk a little bit about just how abnormal of a daily life this really is in comparison to so many other professions.
Right. You know, I've debriefed people in media and in the medical field, especially through COVID, and then also in my field. And, you know, what we always try and do, and I've heard that from everybody who's spoken so far, is something called a professional detachment. I mean, think if a doctor has to operate, you know, if they had to think about what they're doing, they couldn't do it. With me, it's a little bit less gory. But with you guys, you know, you can't get away, can you? You know, it's right in your face, the sounds, the smells, the visuals. So you're doing my job, doctor's job, and yours. So it is highly abnormal. And when we're looking at PTSD, it is all about being subjected to something abnormal. And so you can have acute, you know, one-time event, one kind of, you know, natural disaster or something, or a big loss, or you can have chronic. And I think that's what wears you down. You know, most people can handle when there's one acute loss or trauma. But when that is your life, you know, every week, they're half the week, 3-4 days at a time, or even a few days every month, there's this acute trauma that's kind of in your face. That's a different ballgame. So it becomes incredibly important to just regularly step out. And the analogy I use is, you know, this is a horrible one, but if you cook a frog, the frog's in the water and you just make the water hotter, 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 and eventually the frog is dead. It doesn't jump out. So in your line of work especially, you've got to get out of that pot. Get out of that pot. Just check, how am I? Am I in one piece? You know, what's the heat like in that pot? Because if you don't, eventually you're just not even going to know you've got PTSD. It becomes your new normal. Yeah. So it's incredibly important to do those checks from time to time.
Yeah, it's brave to do it, I must say. That's what I think of it, right? Dr. Miyaka, let me come to you. You're an industrial psychologist as well, and you work quite closely with media practitioners as well. I mean, some of the concerning moments, the stories that you've heard from journalists, and really what they're not doing or doing for their mental health.
So the harrowing thing about journalists is you just got to get on with it. So over and over as I engage, that is the common theme. Like, well, there's a next story. There's no time to stop. I need to get into this deadline. I need to be the first one to break this news. And that's a hard thing to carry. And I think part of the challenge for a lot of media houses is creating safe spaces where people can just put it down and say, this is hard. I'm not coping. And some of the feedback is I actually need to speak to people who understand. I need to speak to people who've been there and say, oh my gosh, when that gun was held to my head, that was awful. And not our family members who are not there, or a therapist who's never been exposed to that line of work, who's got an abstract idea of the work that we're doing. So there really is a need for media houses to create spaces where the debrief happens in real time, and not wait for it to become PTSD or really just a challenging space where people are not coping.
You know what I wonder is just generally, I think in South African society, people do have a mistrust for mental health practitioners. That's the reality, right? You go back to any one of our communities and you tell a father, Dada, you've got PTSD, go see someone, and he's going to say, he's never going to do that. The likelihood of journalists doing it, I want to hear what that actually sounds like. So, Leon, let me start with you. Your employer says there's a wellness center. I mean, I've seen it where, you know, organizations, media organizations says, here's a wellness center, go use it. Do you use it? Do you trust it?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience working in the newsrooms, yes, those resources are available. But, you know, when you deal with journalists, you deal with people who prefer telling other people's stories, and they hardly want to share their own. So I just think the measures that are put in place.
Oh dear.
Resources in the newsrooms, and even then you still have those who work outside as freelancers and so forth. So the challenge now is how do you get them to be able to share their stories, also use those resources in the newsroom. I mean, I think the strategy needs to change, because also there's no follow-ups, you know. After your cover story like Marikana, you still left on your own to figure out how do you deal with the stress that came with covering such a violent situation. You know, the debriefing, which is very, very important.
Okay, Leon, I'm going to have to cut out because your line is giving us some trouble.
But the only challenge that...
Yeah, that line is giving us such trouble. Yeah. I'm going to come back to you, okay? And just hold on to that last thought, because you're sharing so much in that line, just giving us some trouble. And I know you want to jump in, Vanya. Just want to take a quick call in. We're taking calls, 011-714-0661. And Pakudi is calling. Thank you so much for calling in. Good morning, Pakudi. I believe you're a former video journalist yourself.
Good morning, my sister. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for calling into the show.
Thank you, thank you. You know, my name is Mpakodi, and I'm that guy who was producing, quickly, and my English is not that fluent, okay. But I'm going to try. Okay, give you the problem, yeah, that stress. So there's a place called Jihalaupeng. They run my own studio, independent. So actually independent, yeah, by the other day, capture like the daily videos. So, but so to each young asset too much, we don't go to get a second. I didn't know from Gavagalore. Evan Roha, so Maroa, so attendant too much. Camarame, Opolare, and Abambar, Twitter, and Abarvotarne. Don't shoot me, Ustavo, or Charles can Chagamara video. But by that time, they didn't check a rato, but the Gavagalore. Mafelomba ije passeja ilo gore ba tshita na go pshatla di camera tsa ka di ka bona ile gore go kaone ke no fetsa ke tlogetse taba ya journalist.
Yeah, that's sad, because now that means we've lost a storyteller in a community that needs it. And Pakodi was speaking there from Limpopo, saying he was a former video journalist himself who ran a small studio for independently in Groblersdal, and he stopped the work because he just got tired of the verbal attacks that he got from people. And that's a reality. There's the verbal attacks. The verbal attacks, not just in your face, but on social media. And those are serious things. Vanya, but you wanted to step in a little earlier.
Yeah, I wanted to add to what Leon had said. You know, yes, we have access to things like wellness centers. But having mental issues in the newsroom, it's still very stigmatized. I covered some really horrible stories, and after I was diagnosed, I spoke to my executive producer, and she said to me, listen, depression and anxiety is the white man's illness. you need to snap out of it. You need to bring me the stories. And so I think many journalists, they deal with it on their own. That's what I've been doing after that comment. And so we don't trust wellness because we don't know if what we tell them will be relayed
against us.
Yes. And so I think that stigmatization needs to, in 2023, it just, I don't know if it will ever die, but that is what media practitioners that's in the field face. Bosses, they just want their story. And obviously we are there to do our work, to get the story objectively. But the consequences, there's no support.
Yeah.
So I think that makes it difficult for practitioners to come forward and say, listen, I'm struggling.
Yeah, I've certainly seen it where a professional journalist has a gun held to their head and the next day they're expected to be on the field again.
Absolutely.
Immediately. And there is no discussion of how are you doing, are you okay? But perhaps we need to talk a little bit about that, Dr. Munyaka, about what is it that we need to be doing then from an organizational wellness point of view. I mean, do we start outsourcing these resources so that professionals feel like they can trust wellness programs? We'll talk a little bit about that and a lot more when we come back. Let's take a short break. You're still watching Media and Society. Welcome back. You're watching Media and Society with myself, Naledi Mulao. So journalism really is a demanding and stressful profession with long hours, tight deadlines and exposure to traumatic events. So we're talking about how journalists can take care of their mental health and well-being. And to do that, we are joined in studio by Kabi Njogweni, SABC News video journalist, Vanya van der Heerwe, who is a SABC News reporter and producer, Dr. Sharon Munyaka, who is the current president of Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology of South Africa. And on Zoom, we're joined by Leon Sadiki, a photojournalist, as well as Dr. Kalinda Linda, who is a clinical psychologist and chairperson of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. So, Vanya, you made such an important point before we got into the break there, right? That, well, for the most part, a lot of journalists don't trust wellness programs within their building because there is a fear, and we talked about this as well during the break, that there is a fear that once I go and disclose to wellness that I have PTSD or depression, that my line manager will find out, and it will seem as if I'm not cut out for the job. You agree with that, Gabi?
I do. You'd be, deemed unfit, and you can't go to certain assignments. Now you're being treated in a certain way. It will happen.
Yeah.
Vanya was right.
Yeah, that's the fear. So what do we do then, organizationally and structurally? I mean, that's a tough one.
So when we look at organizations, there are people who hold power. There are people who have convening power. So if I am the lead reporter, I am the lead of the organization, I need to normalize talking about the challenges of mental health. And the power of our stories, it's so impactful. And I've seen some courageous journalists who've started speaking out and said, you know what, I'm struggling. I was put out into the field, no experience. I was young. I got in there, had to hold a story, no debrief. And I fell into this deep, dark hole of depression, and I didn't know what was wrong. So when leaders step up and normalize it, learn the language, because the World Health Organization has really put out guidelines now in 2022 to help us to say, what is the language? What does it mean when we say I'm burnt out? What does it mean when I'm anxious? I'm feeling a little off and I'm trying to pick myself up, but I just cannot shake off the feeling. How do I know when I need to look for help? So when we start having the language, when we start normalizing talking about these challenges, it gives other people permission. So as much as wellness centers are set up, people are not going to trust it because the leader is not taking it up. So for me, it starts with the leadership normalizing, owning it and saying, it's okay to not be okay because we are human first before our stories, before these boxes that society has placed on us.
Yeah. I want to talk about coping mechanisms that journalists do use if they don't use the wellness programs, or they don't speak to the South African Depression and Anxiety Group or get in touch with Dr. Munyaka? Because that's the dodgy conversation that a lot of journalists don't want to broach. Leon, I see you nodding, and I'm going to bring this one to you. What are the coping mechanisms that you've seen people around you use?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen journalists, resorting to substance abuse, drinking a lot, just avoiding the more formal route of engaging with the professional, because as my colleagues have said, that it kind of suggests that you don't have the, lack of a better word, you don't have the guts to cover certain stories. So there are those mechanisms that the journalist would resort to, as I've mentioned. And it's not the most easiest thing. That's why I think newsrooms, the ecosystem in the newsroom needs to change. We need an active solution where we need to follow up on debrief prior to the story, during the story, also after, just to understand how stable our colleagues are. Can they be able to continue, so as they're also open and feel to say if they can't continue, they can tell the editor to say, no, I can't continue on the story because it has affected me this much. So that training, both, journalists on the ground and I think the editors in the newsrooms, they also need to be aware of these, kind of challenges that journalists face on day to day.
Okay. It's an interesting one because you say, approach it and say, I'm not able to do that story. And Vanya just shook her head because that's never going to happen. Which journalist is going to say, I can't do that story? The more bloodier it is, the more you want that story because that's the tough stuff. And journalists want to be brave. They want to face the tough stuff. But the coping mechanisms, Gabi, you've seen this. I mean, let's talk about that. We've normalized substance abuse in the media fraternity. That's a fact.
It is. I mean, but that's just gonna, take you into another sinkhole, I mean, there's other coping mechanisms that you can adopt, because we've started the SABC tennis club now. So we take a few guys, go out and swing rackets and hit over the net, go for a run and just take it easy, whenever we're not on the field, just to kind of reset your mind. Like you were saying earlier, and just kind of jump out of the pot and then come in back again, you fresh, and you've got a new perspective, and you can go in, breathe more tear gas and handle more stones. You know what I mean? You just need to find alternative kind of ways. After my incident, I did consult the professionals, and I had to chat to the lady, and she was asking the same question you're asking a lady. So what do you do? No, I'd go for a run. I'm okay. But the dreams at night and, struggle to sleep, and you think my whole pattern is kind of disturbed. So, yeah, I mean, there are alternatives. Substance abuse won't help. So, yeah, that's my kind of...
But you've seen it, Vanya.
Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, and to add on to what Leon had said, when I was a print journalist, my editor used to say, he could see we are rattled when we come back. Write the story, get it out of your system, and you'll be fine.
That's not.
And it doesn't work that way. We're humans. So, so you, like Gabi said, you go home, you have the nightmares, you sit. For years, while I was a crime reporter, I stayed inside. I never went out. I just went to work, shops, indoors, because I had this fear. And I knew something was amiss. This is not normal. And instead of going to wellness, I would pay a psychologist, a private psychologist, to talk about this. So coping mechanisms, like you said, substance abuse is rife among our colleagues, and we can't judge them. Although we know there are better mechanisms, but we can't judge them.
Yeah.
After I was diagnosed, I had to seek other alternatives, and I started hiking, and
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Linda, let me bring you in here. Earlier you made that analogy that we keep referring to here, and I think because it really hits home, right? Step out and be that frog that steps out of the pot and just check the water temperature every now and then, and that's of course checking in with your wellness. What's on the other side, though? If we stay with the coping mechanisms that we know journalists are using, we know the community of journalists and media practitioners speak about just the habit of drinking and using other substances to keep them going, a lot of it being alcohol, though. What are the consequences of that?
Well, I think everybody's absolutely identified the critical theme, which is we need to take a break. But do you take a functional one or a dysfunctional one? So the dysfunctional is all the dodgy things like the substance abuse, and sometimes people use food, and there are all sorts of things that we shouldn't be doing. And so then the functional ones I've also heard, which is, shifting yourself somewhere like hiking, nature, that sort of thing. So the problem is, the short answer is, if you stay in the pot, you're going to fry, and the problem is that you can be impaired. And think about, for example, if you become impaired and you become, you get so traumatized, you become cynical. And you have this detachment where you just really don't care anymore about anyone or anything. You're not going to be the most responsible person reporting, are you? Because you're going to be so desensitized. And I've sometimes seen that with headlines on various publications where it's sure, that was a bit harsh. And I'm not going to traumatize you guys by quoting some of them, but they sort of hit me. And I guess it's like what we would call compassion fatigue, but this is far worse, because you're the conduit between the news and the public. So if you're desensitized and you've gone cynical and you've gone detached because you're feeling fried yourself, that's obviously going to have a much wider impact, because, you're not going to be as responsible with your reporting. And there's no judgment there, because, if you're a frog and you're almost cooked, one can understand that. So there are some dire consequences, especially when you're the lens or the conduit between what's happening and the broader audience. Yeah. You can understand that would be quite a big side effect on a big scale.
Yeah, that's quite a wake-up call, isn't it, for every journalist, I think, that's watching, any storyteller that's watching, and says, well, if I become cynical, I become ineffective even at the job that I'm trying to protect by keeping so stoic. I mean, that's quite a wake-up call. Let's take call 011-714-0661. Milton has called in. Milton, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Naledi. This is a fantastic topic, by the way, so kudos to SABC to have this discussion. It should not stop here this morning, today, this week, this month, this year. It must be an ongoing discussion. But what I wanted to add to the fantastic discussion that you're already having is that there are other areas of news production that needs to be taken into consideration. So, for instance, you are talking to people who've been in the field, who've seen traumatic experiences, but there are many people who are sitting in the newsroom, in the production room, who are receiving the material from the field, and they are not really seen on television. We never see them or hear them on radio or see their bylines in newspapers. They are just as critical, because when you see what is traumatic in the field and you send it back to headquarters to be processed, those people are taking in those pictures, like picture editors, for instance. They see all the pictures that you film on the field, and they receive it, and they have to edit it and make it look cleaner for the audiences at home. And then there are sub-editors, people who are taking in, especially now with social media, the people you send the pictures to before it gets published, those people are also taking in a lot of trauma from what they are seeing, even if they were not there. Yeah. So it's very important. The last thing I wanted to say is that in terms of solutions, there's something we used to use when I was bureau chief for BBC News. We used a buddy-buddy system. It's a very important thing. Colleagues should watch over each other, not being nosy, but you must know that if your friend smokes cigarettes regularly and suddenly you notice that they're going through more cigarette packs than normal, you must ask yourself why. It means something is happening. Or if people are social drinkers and suddenly they're drinking heavily, you must make a decision, conscious decision, to ask what's wrong. Why are you drinking more than normal now? Okay, so that buddy-buddy system is very helpful as part of the solution. And of course, debriefing is pretty much the number one. I mean, the psychologists will tell you, you must debrief. It doesn't matter whether to the boss or to your family or to your friends and colleagues, but you got to share your experience. And, and thank you. That's my 2 cents for this morning. Thank you so much for a lovely topic.
No, we really, really appreciate the call as well and that input. Some great ideas there on really good ways for journalists and people in the, I think, media practitioners as a whole to hold each other accountable and to keep each other in one piece. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk about now a few, ideas. So let's share more ideas and especially recommendations for particularly media organizations. Stay with us. All right, you're still watching Media and Society. Wrapping up our discussion now on the psychological impact of reporting on traumatic events for journalists and media practitioners. But now let's get into a few resolutions, right? And I want to go down the line. Leon, let's start with you. What is it that you would like to see as a support structure that makes it easier for yourself and your colleagues? And I've got about a minute for this.
You know what? I know that SANEF had partnered with the South African Depression and Anxiety Group to try and address these challenges in the newsroom. But more than that, I think we also need to go down, in high learning institutions. When these students are being taught to be journalists, they equally need to be told of the challenges and the trauma and the stress that you can experience as a journalist. Yeah. So for me, I think it needs to start there, so as you don't then at a later stage find them buckling under pressure because they also don't understand why they're experiencing certain things. So I think more active solution will assist our newsrooms. It should not be a once-off engagement. It need to be a constant conversation with colleagues in the newsroom. A more dedicated, department or a person that is responsible in following up on colleagues in the newsroom, understanding if they understand the dangers and the after effects of covering a particular story.
Okay, well, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Linda, quickly from you, what SADC can offer us? So, Leon's already told us about your partnership with SANEF.
Yes. So SADC has an SMS number. It's a free resource for people who are media practitioners. The number is 319985, and it's a 24/7 availability. So that's the SADC contribution. And then just a quick thing for the individual, because of course the systemic needs to happen and the support. But for the individual, what helps you is just when you're in something where you just cannot deal with it in the moment, afterwards, wherever you are, just break contact for a few moments and just look at the back of your eyelids. And I promise you it sounds simple, but it does work. So it's just a mini break out of that thought.
Okay, well, I'm still on air, so I'll try it just after 10 o'clock. Dr. Linda, thank you so much. Vanya, your recommendations, whether it be this media house, all media houses, what you want to see happen?
All media houses. I think educate everyone across the board. I think it's 2023. People have access to inform themselves about depression, anxiety. And they probably, as we spoke earlier, have the senior people, such as the editors, they've gone through this themselves. I think just a bit of empathy. And stop the stigmatization.
And stop the stigmatization of the saying, I'm not okay.
Yes,
absolutely. We need to reiterate that over and over again. Gabi, from you?
So I always recommend being more active. I think we should take responsibility as media practitioners, just to be more active, just have an outlet, It could be anything. Vanya hikes, they cycle.
Mine is boxing.
I truly recommend having an outlet. I would take a skateboard and just go skating downtown, and go play some tennis, and you'll be, I think, you'll be fine. And just, the issue of leadership as well. I think our leaders should take more.
And quickly, how do we get in touch with you guys? Sorry, I'm out of time.
So SIOPSA, we have a website. Please feel free to contact us, but organize your work schedules. Be courageous enough to disrupt the algorithm and say, I am not okay.
Yeah.
Let's start normalizing mental health and get to wellness.
So that we stay empathetic and solid storytellers that care about the story that we tell, because we're able to handle it. That's where we'll leave it. Thank you so much for joining us here on Media and Society. Continue interacting with us on Twitter. We look forward to spending time with you again next week, Sunday. Have yourselves a wonderful afternoon.